you grew up, the house you grew up in, or the farm you grew up on, or the apartment you grew up in, or wherever it was that you grew up, think about the place you grew up. And for kids especially, that's probably the house that you're in now, or the place you live now. But think to the place you grew up. Now think about the people who lived around you. The people who lived nearby, the people you could see. Think about your neighbors. And turn to somebody next to you and tell them the names of the people that you can remember who lived near you, who are your neighbors. So, go, just mention a couple names of your neighbors. So it sounds like you all can remember quite a few names. How many of you launched into stories about your neighbors? I heard a few stories start. Yeah. I grew up on a court, and so there were 6 houses that opened up onto this court. And to the left of us were the Alderettis, and then there was us, and then there was a house next to us that people moved in and out of a lot, so we never really got to know them, and I don't remember who was there. On the other side of them was the Adams. It wasn't the Adams family, but it was the Adams. Around there was the Einhorns, and they had a son that I played with a lot, named David. And directly across the court from us were the Elliots. They were really nice, sweet people. I never would have pegged the wife as a racy romance novelist, but she was. I was never allowed to read them. Probably a good thing. But she was a romance novelist. My mom read them and said, no, you're not allowed. I mean, these are our neighbors. These are the people that we live nearby and we live around. So, and similarly to what Ashley was talking about, are our neighbors these people that we just live next door to or across the street from? Now, what about a block away? Or what about a neighborhood away? Or what about the people we know but we don't live right next door to? Now, how far does this go? According to the Neighborhood Watch group, a training session that we had in our area of the neighborhood a few years ago, they said that our neighbors looked like this. Our house in the middle, one house diagonally across the street next to either side, that was our neighbor. Those were our neighbors. Those are the people we watched out for and they watched out for us. That's how we understood, according to them, that neighbors worked. That's how we defined neighbors. Now, literally, the definition of neighbors is people who live near and next to us. So my neighbors are the people that live nearby and next to me. Your neighbors are the people that live nearby and next to you. RiverCross Church's neighbors are the people that live nearby and next to RiverCross Church. This up here next is a map of the neighborhood where we are. And Shannon Ranch School is in the middle of that orange or brown circle that you see there. That is this neighborhood. On the left is Demery going up and down. On the right is Mooney going up and down. And on the bottom is Riggin, and on the top is Pratt. This is less than 1 square mile. It's a mile left to right. It's 0.6 of a mile north to south. It's less than a square mile. And in this square mile, or less than square mile, there are about 2,000 homes. That's 4,000 to 5,000 people, probably, give or take, but at least 4,000 or 5,000 people. Are these our neighbors? Awesome! Let's go home! I would say so. Jesus talked a lot about neighbors too. And Jesus talked about what a neighbor is and what a neighbor isn't, and let's talk about and figure out this whole neighbor thing. And when he talked about neighbors, he told an epic story to get it across. And what made it epic was several pieces in the story that we're going to look at. This is probably one of the most often preached, often studied, often looked at, often read, often in the kids' Sunday schools, often in everything. This is one of the most widely known stories that Jesus told, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's all about neighbors, because that's how it started out. But in the story, Jesus really redefines what a neighbor is and encourages us to think bigger about who a neighbor is and what it looks like to be a neighbor. So we're going to read the story. It is in your bulletin, or it's going to be up on the screen. It's Luke chapter 10, if you'd like to flip there as well, if you brought a Bible. And it goes like this. The man wanted to justify his actions. It was a man who came to Jesus. And so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Which prompted Jesus to reply with the story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by him. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bills run higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." "Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by the bandits?" Jesus asked. The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same." So for the man who asked the question and got the story told to him, he was the Jewish guy. And for him and a lot of his friends and neighbors, they thought of their neighbors largely as people like him or people like them. They were trained to think of their neighbors that way. And it was a little bit challenging for their background and their faith because they had some competing things that they were taught. You know, on the one hand, their God, who they followed, had great compassion for the widows and the orphans and the poor and the hungry around them. And they were taught to have compassion and love those whom God loves. At the same time, they were taught to keep themselves clean and keep themselves separate from people that could possibly taint them or in any way get in the way of their faith or cause problems for them in any way. So they had to figure out, well, if God loves them and I'm taught to love them and sort of be a neighbor to them, but now I've got to figure out how does that work with being faithful to God and being able to carry out my religious duties. And so it was a little bit easier to just default to being neighbors to the people who are like them. It's a little bit easier, doesn't take quite as much work, and it's easier oftentimes to just love the people who are similar to you. So he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And this is sort of his mindset as he would come into this. So of course, as Jesus tends to do, he likes to shake things up a little bit. And so, several things in the story, he says, I think make it particularly epic. One of them is the string of people that come along. Of course, there's the priest that comes along, who's the one who lives and works in the temple. His life is dedicated to the temple. He is focused on his temple work and his faithfulness to God. He's the holy and the righteous kind of a priest. Second is the dedicated temple assistant, who similarly has to sort of keep his life in order, and he is in charge of taking care of the sacrifices and the religious systems for all the people that come to the temple. And then there's the Samaritan, someone from a race of people who the Jews did not like, somebody who was opposite what these 2 others were pretty much like, and were pretty much hated by some of these other Jewish people. And that's, of course, the one person who's willing to help the man who is robbed and beaten. Second thing that makes this sort of a big deal is that this happens on the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Now, Jesus could have told this anywhere. He could have said, this is happening in Galilee, or this is happening in anywhere. But he chose to tell the story on the road traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, downhill to Jericho. You saw pictures when the scripture was on the screen. Those are pictures of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was an often traveled road. It was kind of like Moody Boulevard. It was where everybody went, and it was a well-traveled road. But it was not a safe road. It was also a road away from Jerusalem, which is sort of a little jab on the Jewish people because their neighborhood was Jerusalem. And for Jesus to say this guy was going out of Jerusalem and away is sort of a jab, as if to say, you might think you're neighborly, but I'm not so sure you really get what neighbor is all about. Third little thing that he adds in is that all these people had a lot of things to consider. The priest had a lot of things to consider. He had his job and his life and his calling and his family and his lineage to consider. Because if he helped out this guy, he became unclean. If he got too close, if he touched him, if he did all kinds of things, he would get in the way of his religious duties, and he would have to take a step back from those while he went through all this ceremonial cleansing and fixing that problem. So he had some things to consider. Is it worth the risk? Similarly, the temple assistant had the same kinds of risks. He was in charge of all this religious duty for people, and he had the same challenges. And he had to consider, is it worth the risk? The Samaritan had some risks too. Granted, they were completely different than the others, but his risk was reputation. And am I willing to interact with people who hate me? And am I willing to overstep my boundaries? Because people don't overstep boundaries. So is he willing to take that kind of a risk? Well, all this leads up to Jesus answering the original question, which is, who is my neighbor? And if Jesus had an answer to this question, if he said it in different words rather than just the story, I think he might say that a neighbor is anyone who needs God's mercy. Whoever it is, regardless of these risks, regardless of these considerations, regardless of these problems, it's anybody who just needs God's mercy. And what I think of first is I think of RiverCross Church's neighbors, our neighbors. I think of our neighbors, and I think of the neighborhoods that we're in. I think of the broader neighborhoods that we're around. And when we started this church, I recall very vividly that one of the most poignant things we did is we looked at a map, similar to these maps, but it was exactly this map. And it was a map of the city of Visalia boundaries, and it was a bunch of little red dots marking all the churches, most of the churches in Visalia. So we plotted all of these churches in Visalia and said, where is a church planted already in Visalia? And where is sort of a mark of God doing some work? And so we looked at that map, and the more we looked at it, we realized, well, there's different voids, because there's a lot of concentration of churches right in the middle of downtown. There's a lot of concentration down on the south end of town, which is awesome. And of course, this is not about being territorial or slipping in between one church or another. It's about looking and seeing, well, where is God's work happening through churches, and maybe where is there a void? And when we looked at that, we noticed, well, in the north side of town, there is this void. And we realized, wait a minute, that's where several of us live. And that's where there are new neighborhoods being built. And there are no churches there. And there needs to be another red dot in that area, which is now RiverCross Church. And it's our job to share God's mercy with people who need it. I mean, it is an honor, it's a privilege to be able to share God's mercy with people who need it. That's why we exist. Or even, not only God's mercy, but to show the love of God, or the compassion of God, or the excitement of God, or the tenderness of God, or whatever the moment of God or the activity of God is, to be able to share that with people. And we've done so much of that, and I love the things that we've done. I mean, we have walked around these neighborhoods, and many of us have prayed for neighbors. We have a prayer box we've mentioned before in the workroom, in the teacher's workroom in the school. And just this last week, we had to restock the prayer request slips that we left there because they've been used up. And that's great news. We get the honor of praying for people, some of whom we don't even know. And they drop prayer requests in that box. We get exposure to these things in people's lives. We've been able to do a vacation Bible school at Christmas just a couple months ago, and to share the mercy and the love of Jesus with 50 kids, most of whom we did not know, most of whom were from this neighborhood. We've gotten to serve a family who had significant needs just before Christmas that we just fell upon a week before Christmas, and we got to bless them and encourage them. We got to go Christmas caroling right before Christmas and go up to people's doors just right over here, this next block over, and to tell them about our vacation Bible school and encourage them with the fact that a church is here. And something fascinating happened when we did that. About 20 of us were there, 25 of us were there. We walked up to one of the doors after singing and blessing them with our 4-part harmony music, right? And we walked up to their door and we gave them a flyer about our vacation Bible school. We gave them candy canes and let them know about our church. And one of the ladies said, well, this is the church that meets at the school, right? And we said, yes. And she said, I was walking through the parking lot a few months ago, and I shared with somebody who was standing out front that we needed prayer for my dad. And that did indeed happen. And that person who was out there brought the prayer request in here during our prayer time, and we prayed for him. And she shared with us at the door, she said, and my dad was healed. Thank you for praying for him. I mean, we got to be part of God doing some merciful, amazing work. And what a privilege it is to see that happen. Our calling as followers of Christ and as part of RiverCross Church is to share the mercy and the power and the love of God with people who need it most. And for a long time, God has said this sort of thing. It's nothing new. God has often said, love your neighbor as yourself. God means it. This is important. This is valuable. This is something that has gone on and on. This is part of who God is. And it's one thing for us to do this on our own. For me to say, I need to share the love and the mercy of Christ more. And for you to go out and share the mercy and the love of God with people who need it. But what if we do it together? I mean, there's power in numbers. There's inertia when we're united together. There's some amazing things that happen when we're together when we do this. And what if we extended the mercy of God to people who need it, and we did it together in even more ways than we already are? I think if we did, it might take on a few characteristics. And maybe even we could take a few cues from the Samaritan in the story. Just a few. One is we might be encouraged to cross the road. Now granted, we at RiverCross Church, we don't cross roads, we cross rivers. But it goes the same way. We might be encouraged to cross the road. Because the Samaritan didn't have to. I mean, the priest didn't. The temple assistant did, but then ducked back. But the Samaritan crossed the road. And sometimes what it takes is just crossing over to extend a hand, get in a conversation, and that might be across the street from our house, that might be down the street, that might be who knows where. But whatever it is that road is to cross, we might need to cross a road in order to share the mercy of God with somebody who needs it. It might mean that we take a risk. I mean, the Samaritan took a whole lot of risks. He risked his finances, he risked his reputation, he risked his own safety, his own health, he risked all kinds of things. And sometimes it takes a risk to share the mercy of God with others. I think it's easy sometimes to go too far with taking a risk. I mean, we don't need to completely throw safety and logic to the wind and just say, no matter what, I will help. But we can always take a risk. Because if God calls us, then we figure out what that means and what that looks like. We can also act generously, like a lot of these materials that we've been encouraging all of us to adopt as part of the season of Lent, and to do Lent generously, as these materials encourage us to do, to be generous. I mean, the Samaritan was generous with his own resources, his oil and his money and his open tab for the guy's needs. I mean, there were all kinds of things that he was generous with. And what would it look like for us to extend the mercy of Christ generously to others who have need? The Samaritan started by doing his work by himself. But he didn't finish the work by himself. He asked the innkeeper to help him out. And who knows if there were others. But he didn't do it all by himself. And I think that if we do things together, not just by ourselves, then there's some new and creative and fresh ideas and ways of serving that we might be able to be part of. A few weeks ago, Jim and Ryan shared with us about our church's budget, our first ever church budget. And it's like going. I'm not a big fan of going to the store and trying on clothes, but I feel like this season of life that we're in is sort of going into the dressing room and pulling a bunch of clothes in there of different sizes and different shapes. And, you try one on and you think, that doesn't quite fit. So we take it off. And we put another piece of clothing on and we think, that fits. I mean, we're in this season of just trying different things on to see what's the stuff that fits God's call for RiverCross Church. So as they were talking about this about this budget, they were talking about the different pieces of the budget. If you recall, we structured the budget in terms of worship and connect and serve. The way that we talk about the church. We step into worship together, we step into serve, to connect together so that our faith grows, and we step into serve to extend the love of Christ to people. And there were certain things that are in the worship category and certain things that are in the connect category. And when it came down to the serve category, we've allocated a certain portion of our budget to serve. But we have no idea what we're going to use the money for. And I think that's so cool. Because we get to figure out how do we get to share the mercy of God with people who need it. And we have some resources to back it up already. I mean, this is a wide open opportunity. And all we need is to listen, to ask questions, and for God to give us ideas that we can do together. At the end of April, we are going to be one of 7 churches that's part of Serve Visalia Day, which many of us have been involved in for years before, but this is another season of Serve Visalia Day. And we, as one of the churches, have the opportunity to come up with projects that we can lead, that we can sponsor, that we can put together for other people in addition to ourselves to be involved in. And right now, there are no projects that we have that we're in charge of. So we get the chance to come up with some projects that can be part of Serve Visalia Day, which is 3 hours, a doable project to encourage a school, a nonprofit, some organization in town, some people in our communities, and that we can do together as groups of people. So talk about it. I mean, if you have ideas, if you see a need, if you hear of an organization, if you know a person, if you know of a group of people where there is a legitimate need that could be tackled in a morning by a group of people, then let me know, let Sean know. He's going to be involved in Serve Visalia, and we'll figure out a way that maybe we can make that happen. Because these are ways that together we can share the mercy of God with people around us, our neighbors, who need it. So, let's cross the road, let's take a risk, let's act generously, let's go together so that we can share this mercy of God that He's already given us. Let's pray.